Everything you thought you knew about Jesus could be dead wrong. I'm not talking about some newfangled interpretation or one religious denomination squaring off against another. I'm talking about something far deeper, way more unsettling, and yet ultimately more liberating than anything you ever picked up in a Sunday school, a history class, or some dusty old textbook. There's a message. A specific, direct message Jesus left for humanity, one that's been systematically erased, tampered with, and kept under wraps from the average Joe. A message that, if you truly grasp it today, will fundamentally shift how you see everything around you, reality, spirituality, and most importantly, yourself. This isn't just another religious video. It's not a sermon. And it's definitely not some baseless internet conspiracy theory. What you're about to dive into are historical records, ancient manuscripts, academic research from highly respected universities, and philosophical connections most folks have never been encouraged to make. You're going to get the lowdown on why certain words of Jesus were cut from the Gospels, who made the call on what made it into the Bible, and what got left out, and what those censored words reveal about the spiritual matrix nearly all of us are living in without even realizing it. Ever felt trapped? Not physically locked up, but stuck in a life that feels like a broken record, caught in repeating patterns, limited by beliefs, living in a version of reality that was built for you instead of by you. There's a name for that feeling. First-century Gnostics called it archon. Philosophers called it illusion. Jesus, in the material they tried to scrub, called it something that'll knock you flat on your ass when you hear it. There's a verse, a sequence of teachings, that isn't in the New Testament you're familiar with. Not because it never existed, but because someone at some point in history decided you shouldn't have access to it. And that material, it's been found, cataloged, studied, and what it reveals about Jesus' true spiritual mission is so radically different from what's been preached in churches for 2 millennia that a lot of folks just flat out refuse to face it. But you're not a lot of folks. If you're still here, if this title grabbed you, if something inside you hummed when you read Spiritual Matrix, an erased message, then you're already sensing what this video is about to confirm. Stick around till the end, because what's coming in the next few minutes isn't something you're going to want to miss. Think about it for a second. If Jesus came to this world to set people free, and 2,000 years later most folks are still caught in the same traps of fear, guilt, blind submission, and self-disconnection, then something, somewhere along the line, went seriously sideways. Or it was designed to go sideways. And that's exactly what we're about to dig into. There's one specific detail in this whole saga, a detail almost no one connects, that absolutely flips everything you think about Jesus' teachings, about the Bible, about the church, and about what it truly means to be free, on its head. And I'm going to show you that detail. But first, let me tell you where this whole thing kicked off. Humanity's been wrestling with some big questions for centuries. Why are we here? Who created this world? Why is there suffering if there's a loving God? These questions aren't new, but the answers Jesus supposedly gave, according to the texts that were suppressed, are a whole different ballgame from the answers that made it to us. And the difference between those answers, it's the difference between a life of spiritual captivity and a life of true awakening. This video is about exactly that, and it starts right now. If you've ever felt like there's something behind the curtain, something nobody's telling you about spirituality, about faith, about the true purpose of human existence, then you absolutely need to keep watching. Because over the next little while, you're going to uncover why Jesus' most powerful teachings were scrubbed from the official narrative, who profited from that erasure, and what those teachings tell us about how to break free from a matrix built to keep your consciousness asleep. This channel exists to bring you exactly this kind of content. What's lurking beneath the surface, what the official versions conveniently leave out, and what can genuinely transform your spiritual journey. So if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button now and ring the notification bell, because what's coming in future videos is directly connected to what you're learning today. And if you already feel there's a bigger truth waiting for you, go ahead and smash that like button now, because that simple gesture helps this content reach more people who need to hear this. And in the comments, just type again, that's it, if you're ready for what's next. I want to see how many folks here are truly awake to this conversation. Let's start at the beginning. To grasp what was erased, you need to understand the context in which Jesus' teachings existed before they morphed into what we now know as official Christianity. In the 1st century AD, the Mediterranean world was a melting pot of philosophical and spiritual ideas. There were Jews from various currents, Zoroastrians, Platonists, Neoplatonists, followers of Egyptian mysteries, and one very specific group that's going to be central to this discussion, the Gnostics. The word gnosis comes from Greek and means knowledge. Not common intellectual knowledge, but an inner, direct, experiential knowing. A knowing of who you really are, where you came from, and where you're headed. The 1st and 2nd century Gnostics weren't some fringe cult of lunatics. They were philosophers, theologians, poets, and many of them were Christians. Christians who had access to texts, oral traditions, and interpretations of Jesus' teachings that radically differed from what was solidifying in the big-shot churches of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. They didn't just see Jesus as a savior who died for humanity's sins. They saw Jesus as a revealer, someone who came specifically to show human beings they were trapped inside an illusion, within a system of reality engineered by forces that didn't have humanity's best interests at heart. This view might sound strange, maybe even unsettling, but it has deep historical roots and was championed by some of the most brilliant minds of the ancient world. Valentinus, for instance, was a 2nd century Gnostic Christian theologian who nearly became Bishop of Rome. He almost made it to the top of the very hierarchy that would later decide what made it into the Bible and what got tossed out. Basilides, another Christian Gnostic, developed a philosophical system of such intricate complexity that modern scholars still dissect its details. Clement of Alexandria, one of the church fathers still considered respectable by Orthodox tradition today, even referenced a secret teaching of Jesus, something passed down only to those who were ready to receive it. What was in this secret teaching? Why would Jesus have kept something just for a smaller circle of disciples? And why was that circle and that knowledge systematically wiped out starting in the 4th century? The answer starts with a concept that's going to pop up repeatedly throughout this discussion. The distinction between the creator God of the material world and the true God, the God who exists beyond all creation. For most Christians today, that distinction doesn't exist. God created the world is good, and the goal of spiritual life is to obey that God and get into paradise after death. Simple, linear. And according to the Gnostics, dead wrong. In the suppressed texts, Jesus talks about a reality far more complex and significantly more disturbing. He speaks of a world created not by the supreme God, but by a lesser being, a demiurge, an entity that believed itself to be the supreme creator but was, in fact, limited, imperfect, and in some texts, directly described as ignorant or even malevolent. And human beings, according to this view, carry within themselves a divine spark, a flicker of the true God, trapped within a system of reality that was constructed to keep them unconscious of this truth. This isn't science fiction. This isn't some New Age fantasy. It's what's written in the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphal of John. Real physical documents, discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in December 1945, when a local peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Salman stumbled upon a ceramic jar buried in a cliffside and opened it to find a collection of 13 papyrus codices that forever changed the history of early Christian studies. These documents had been buried around the 4th century, likely by monks who hid the texts when the Church of Rome, newly legalized by Emperor Constantine, began to persecute and destroy texts that didn't align with the official version of Christianity being consolidated. In other words, these texts were buried to survive institutional censorship. And they did survive. 2 millennia later, they surfaced, and what they say is devastating for anyone who believes they've received the complete, unvarnished version of Jesus' teachings. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, opens with these words, "These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down." And right in the 2nd verse, Jesus says, "Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds, and when he finds, he will be troubled. When he is troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all." Trouble as a necessary stage of spiritual awakening. That's not what gets preached in your average church. This is a radically different message, one that invites humanity to plunge into the discomfort of questioning as a path to freedom. So why was this removed? Why did a teaching that speaks of seeking trouble and inner liberation need to be buried in the Egyptian desert just to survive? The answer to that question is going to confront you with something you've probably already suspected, but maybe never had the words to put a name to. In the 2nd century, there were at least 2 major visions of what Christianity ought to be. One vision stated that salvation came from within, that each human being carried the capacity to awaken to their own divine nature, and that Jesus was the example and guide for this process. The other vision claimed that salvation came from without, that it depended on accepting a specific set of beliefs, belonging to a specific institution, and obeying a hierarchy of priests and bishops who mediated contact between the human and the divine. The first vision empowered the individual. The second created institutional dependency. And, not coincidentally, It was the second vision that won out. Tertullian, one of the most influential theologians of the early church, got right to the point when he attacked the Gnostics. He specifically criticized them for allowing women to teach, for laypeople to debate, for anyone to question what the bishops said. For Tertullian, that was chaos. For the Gnostics, that was freedom. And it's exactly this conflict between institutional control and individual spiritual liberation that lies at the root of everything you're going to grasp today. Now imagine you've lived your entire life hearing only one side of this story. Imagine the books that could have shown you the other side were burned, banned, buried in the desert. Imagine the teachers who taught that other vision were hunted down and silenced. How much of what you believe about spirituality, about God, about your own spiritual worth, was shaped by a choice made by powerful men in the 4th century who decided what you could or couldn't know? That's the question that's going to keep echoing as you take in what comes next. But what exactly is this spiritual matrix that Jesus supposedly described in those forbidden texts? And how does it operate even today, in your life, in your daily grind, in the way you relate to the sacred? Because we're not just talking ancient history here. We're talking about something operating right now, in this very moment, as you're taking in this presentation. And when you grasp the mechanism, when you see the structure of this invisible prison, something inside you is going to shift in a way that there's no going back from. Back in 1945, when those manuscripts were unearthed in Nag Hammadi, it took the academic world decades to even begin to process what had been found. Not because the material was tough to translate, though it was, but because what was written on those papyrus pages challenged such fundamental tenets of Western theology that many scholars simply didn't know how to fit it into any narrative they already knew. Professor Elaine Pagels, from Princeton University, spent decades studying these texts and wrote a book called The Gnostic Gospels, which became a bestseller and won the National Book Award. And what she describes in that book is unsettling in a very specific way. Pagels shows that the Nag Hammadi texts aren't just peripheral documents, not the scribblings of some fringe lunatic groups no one took seriously. These are texts that circulated widely in early Christian communities, that had numerous and educated followers, and that represented a version of Jesus' teaching every bit as historically legitimate as the version that was canonized. The difference between what made it into the Bible and what got left out wasn't a difference of antiquity, historical authenticity, or fidelity to Jesus' original teaching. It was a difference of political and institutional expediency. Let's talk specifically about the Gospel of Thomas, because that text is the most significant of all for understanding what we're chewing on here. Unlike the 4 canonical Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas isn't a narrative. It doesn't have a story, no described miracles, no passion and resurrection. It's simply a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, just words. And some of those words are so radically different from what appears in the canonical Gospels that it's impossible to ignore the chasm between the 2 versions. In Logian 56, Jesus says, "Whoever has found the world has found a corpse, and whoever has found a corpse, the world is not worthy of him." That's Jesus calling the material world a corpse, not a garden created by God, not a divine gift, a corpse. A dead, lifeless thing, whose true nature the awakened being recognizes and from which they liberate themselves. That's a teaching that, if it had been in the Bible you've read your whole life, would have radically changed how you relate to material reality, to consumption, to the pursuit of status, to everything society tells you should want. In Logian 3, Jesus says something even more explosive. If those who lead you say, "Look, the kingdom is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, "It is in the sea," then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is within you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that you are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. The kingdom isn't in the sky. It's not after death. It's not mediated by any institution. It's inside you. Right now. In this very moment. And the key to accessing it. Self-knowledge, gnosis, waking up to your own true nature. Why was this pulled? Why did a message of radical spiritual empowerment, one that tells human beings that divinity is within them and not in some external intermediary, need to be suppressed? The answer is obvious when you think in terms of power. A religion that says God is inside every person doesn't need priests, doesn't need a hierarchy, doesn't need buildings, tithes, institutional obedience. A religion that says you need an intermediary to access the sacred creates a dependency that can be exploited, controlled, monetized. I'm not saying the entire Christian church was built on conscious bad faith. I am saying that the selection process that determined what made it into the biblical canon and what got left out was a deeply political process, driven by humans with human interests, and that the result of that process was, among other things, the systematic removal of any teaching that placed spiritual power in the hands of the individual rather than in the hands of the institution. The Council of Nicaea, in 325 AD, convened by Emperor Constantine, was the moment this became law. Not spiritual law, but imperial law. The Roman state was adopting Christianity as its official religion, and it needed a Christianity that was uniform, controllable, and served the needs of the state. The bishops who arrived in Nicaea didn't debate all the available Christian texts in a sincere search for spiritual truth. They debated in an atmosphere of intense political pressure, with a pagan emperor who had only recently persecuted Christians now sitting at the head of the table, dictating what was heresy and what was orthodoxy. And the outcome of that council, and those that followed, was the creation of an official catalog of sacred texts, the Bible as we know it, and the condemnation of all others. Athanasius of Alexandria, in 367 AD, sent out a paschal letter to the churches of Egypt listing the 27 books of the New Testament and ordering the destruction of any other text not on that list. It's highly probable that it was in response to this very order that the monks of the Nag Hammadi monastery buried their texts in the desert. They chose to bury them rather than destroy them. And thanks to that act of defiance, we have access to them today. But here's the kicker, the question few ever bring up. What else was destroyed? The Nag Hammadi texts survived by sheer luck, because someone buried them in a rock in the Egyptian desert instead of burning them. How many other texts weren't so lucky? How many other versions of Jesus' teachings were simply wiped clean, tossed into the bonfires of imperial orthodoxy, lost forever? What does humanity not know about Jesus because someone, 1600 years ago, decided we shouldn't? That question doesn't have a definitive answer, but the question itself, it's already devastating. Because it forces you to recognize that what you've received as the Word of God is, in fact, a curation made by human hands, with human motivations, in a specific political context. And what different version of that curation could have existed, and what it might have taught you about who you are, and what the purpose of your existence is, that's what we're digging into right now. The concept of a spiritual matrix isn't some modern metaphor cooked up after a sci-fi movie. It's an ancient concept, with deep roots in the Gnostic texts we're laying out. The Gnostics described human existence as a prison, not a physical jail, but a prison of consciousness. A system of illusions and conditioning that keeps humanity unaware of its true nature, trapped in a cycle of suffering, reincarnation, and a search for satisfaction in a material world that is, by definition, incapable of delivering the fulfillment a human being truly craves. And what's most unsettling of all, according to these texts, this prison wasn't built by accident. It was constructed. And once you grasp who built it and why, the reality you know is going to start looking a whole lot different than it did before you hit play on this video. Are you feeling it? That sense that there's something just beyond the veil, something that's always been there but never had a name or a form. If this video is hitting on something you've always suspected but could never quite articulate, drop the word Gnosis in the comments right now. Just that. I want to see how many of you are feeling what these ancient texts describe as the first sign of spiritual awakening. The realization that the reality you've been presented isn't the whole picture. Because what comes next, the exact structure of this spiritual prison, and how Jesus described the way out, is where this video goes from interesting to absolutely transformative. To truly grasp the scope of what's been suppressed, you need to move beyond theories and look at the concrete evidence. And it's out there. It's abundant. It's academic. It's verifiable. And it's available to anyone willing to dig for it. The issue isn't that this information is secret in the sense of being inaccessible. The issue is that it's never been presented to most people clearly, cohesively, and with the gravity it deserves. Let's start with the Nag Hammadi manuscripts themselves. These documents were translated and published in English back in 1977 by Harper & Row, in an academic edition organized by James Robinson from Claremont University, featuring contributions from over 50 international scholars. This isn't fringe material. This is the most rigorous academic scholarship available on the subject. And what these scholars concluded, after decades of analysis, is that at least some of the Nag Hammadi texts are as old as the canonical Gospels, and in some cases, possibly even older in their original oral form. The Gospel of Thomas, in particular, has been dated by researchers like Helmut Koester from Harvard University as containing layers of tradition stretching back to the 1st century, possibly as early as the 50s or 60s AD. This means the text could be contemporary with Paul's letters, which are the oldest parts of the canonical New Testament. The notion that Gnostic texts are late and secondary writings, a view widely propagated by traditional Christian apologetics, simply doesn't hold up under serious academic scrutiny. But the evidence goes beyond the Nag Hammadi texts. There's another collection of documents few people are aware of, the Oxyrhynchus papyri. Discovered in the late 19th century by British archaeologists in an Egyptian town called Oxyrhynchus, these papyri represent one of the greatest archaeological finds in history. We're talking hundreds of thousands of fragments from ancient world documents, many of them Christian, which have been analyzed and published since 1898, and the cataloging work is still ongoing. Among these fragments, Greek versions of some of the sayings from the Gospel of Thomas were found, confirming the antiquity and widespread circulation of this material in the early Mediterranean world. And there's more. The Gospel of Mark, the earliest of the canonical Gospels, ends abruptly at chapter 16, verse 8, in the oldest known copies. The women leave the tomb and say nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Period. The text just stops there. The longer versions of Mark's ending, those with appearances of the resurrected Jesus and the commission to go throughout the whole world, are later additions, recognized as such by the vast majority of New Testament scholars. What does that mean? It means the oldest gospel we have didn't originally conclude with a triumphant missionary commission. It ended with silence and fear. And someone, at some point, felt the need to tack on a different ending. Scholar Bart Ehrman, a professor at the University of North Carolina and a former Christian fundamentalist who became one of the world's foremost experts on New Testament texts, has meticulously documented in his books, especially Misquoting Jesus, published in 2005, how biblical texts were altered over centuries by scribes who weren't mere copyists, but editors making conscious choices about what to include, what to omit, and how to modify the text to align it with the theological needs of their era. Ehrman identified hundreds of thousands of textual variants among existing New Testament manuscripts. Hundreds of thousands. That's across a corpus of 27 books. There is no original. Not a single autograph of the Gospels has survived. All we have are copies of copies of copies, some separated from the originals by centuries, each with its variations, its insertions, its omissions. And the text that has come down to us, the New Testament as we know it, is an editorial reconstruction based on a process that involved human choices at every single stage. This isn't to say the text has no value. It means the idea that it's the pure, uncontaminated Word of God is historically unsustainable. Now consider the impact of that. If the text that reached us already went through that level of transformation and editing, imagine what was completely excluded from the process. Imagine the texts that never even made it into contention because they were destroyed too early. The Gnostics were systematically persecuted. Irenaeus of Lyon, in the 2nd century, wrote a 5-volume treatise called Against Heresies, whose explicit goal was to refute and destroy Christian Gnosticism. Epiphanius of Salamis, in the 4th century, wrote the Panarion, an encyclopedia of heresies describing over 80 groups he considered deviant. Many of these groups left no record of their own because their texts were wiped out. What we know about them comes exclusively from their enemies. And you know what historians say about sources that come solely from a group's adversaries. You have to treat them with extreme caution, because no one trying to destroy a movement is going to describe it fairly or completely. And for centuries, the entire history of Christian Gnosticism was told by its destroyers, until the sands of Egypt gave back what had been hidden within them. The most devastating proof, however, doesn't come from the Gnostic manuscripts. It comes from the canonical Gospels themselves, read with enough attention to notice what's being hinted at in the margins of the official text. In John chapter 10, verse 34, Jesus quotes Psalm 82. "Is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods?" If he called them gods, to whom the word of God came and the scripture cannot be broken, how can you say of him whom the Father sanctified and sent into the world, you are blaspheming? Because I said, I am the Son of God. Jesus isn't just defending himself against an accusation. He's quoting a psalm that affirms the divine nature of human beings and using it as an argument. And that verse remained in the canon, apparently because no one realized how much it contradicted the theology of humiliation and unworthiness that dominated Christian thought for centuries. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 17, verse 21, records Jesus saying, "The kingdom of God does not come with observation, nor will they say, 'See here,' or 'See there.' For indeed, the kingdom of God is within you. Within you, not in a temple, not in an institution, not after death in some distant paradise. Inside you, right now, as you exist." This verse is in the Bible, but it's not what's taught. It's not the core message most churches convey. It was left there, but it's been systematically marginalized in favor of a theology that places spiritual power outside the individual and into the hands of intermediaries. The evidence is right there. In manuscripts unearthed in the desert, in academic analyses from prestigious universities, and in the canonical texts themselves, for those with eyes to see. The question isn't if these evidences exist. The question is why they never reached you clearly and accessibly. And the answer to that is what we're going to explore next. There's a pattern in human history that repeats with disturbing regularity. Every time a piece of knowledge has the potential to free people from institutional dependence, that knowledge is attacked, distorted, suppressed, or co-opted. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's what historians call the sociology of knowledge. The recognition that what a society deems truth or heresy is never determined solely by intellectual or spiritual criteria, but by power dynamics. In the case of Christian Gnosticism, the suppression mechanism was particularly efficient because it was backed by the power of the Roman state. When Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 and later made it the preferred religion of the empire, he wasn't making a gesture of personal spiritual devotion. He was making a political calculation. The empire was fragmented, threatened by internal and external pressures, and needed a cohesive ideological force. Christianity, with its organization into dioceses, its episcopal hierarchy, and its ability to mobilize communities, was a perfect political instrument. But only if it was uniform. Only if it spoke with a single voice. One empire, one emperor, one God, one church. The plurality of early Christianity was incompatible with this project. Hence Nicaea, hence the imposition of a single creed, the Nicene Creed, as a test of orthodoxy. Hence the persecution that followed, not just against non-Christians, but against Christians who professed different versions of the faith. The Gnostics, the Arians, the Donatists, the Montanists all were attacked not just as theologically misguided, but as politically dangerous. Because a system that says each person has direct access to the divine within themselves is, by definition, incompatible with any system of centralized control. But here's what makes all of this even more disturbing. The suppression didn't stop in the 4th century. It continued. The medieval Inquisition persecuted movements like the Cathars and the Waldensians, who exhibited philosophical characteristics remarkably similar to ancient Gnosticism. An emphasis on inner knowledge, skepticism toward priestly mediation, and a dualistic view of reality that prioritized spiritual liberation over institutional conformity. The Cathars of southern France were annihilated in the 13th century Albigensian Crusade, a military campaign ordered by Pope Innocent III that resulted in massacres of civilian populations. The city of Béziers, with an estimated population of 15 to 20,000 people, was obliterated in 1209. When a papal legate was asked how to distinguish heretics from Catholics, the response history records is, "Kill them all, God will recognize his own." This is what happens when forbidden knowledge isn't just intellectually suppressed, but perceived as an existential threat to institutional power. The violence isn't an excess. It's the system's logic defending itself. And the texts, the ideas, the teachings that survive that level of violence are texts, ideas, and teachings that someone considered important enough to die to preserve. In the centuries that followed, suppression took more subtle yet equally effective forms. The control of religious education, the prohibition of translating the Bible into vernacular languages, the burning of libraries and manuscripts deemed heretical, the systematic association of any questioning of orthodoxy with evil, with Satan, with eternal damnation. The fear of heresy was cultivated as a control tool so potent that it still operates today, centuries later, in the psychology of millions who feel a physical anxiety when questioning beliefs received in childhood. There's a technical name for this in psychology: avoidance conditioning. When you associate an action, in this case, questioning religious beliefs, with a terrible consequence, in this case, eternal damnation, you create a psychological block that's extremely resistant to rational change. A person doesn't even need to evaluate the arguments. The fear triggers first. And that fear was deliberately implanted by institutions that had an interest in certain questions never being asked. But the forbidden knowledge didn't disappear. It migrated. It went to medieval alchemists, who used the language of chemistry to speak of inner spiritual transformation. It went to Jewish Kabbalists, who developed a system for understanding divine reality of extraordinary complexity and sophistication. It went to Islamic Sufis, who within Islam itself created a mystical tradition of direct access to the divine that constantly collided with religious orthodoxy. It went to the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons, who preserved, encoded, and fragmented forms, elements of an inner knowledge tradition that stemmed from the Gnostics, and before them, from the Egyptian and Greek mysteries. And in the 20th century, it landed on bookstore shelves worldwide when the Nag Hammadi texts finally reached the general public. The suppression worked for 16 centuries, but it didn't work forever. And now that these texts are available, that academic research is accessible, that the internet connects people who might never have encountered this material before, the question remains, what will you do with this knowledge? How does it connect with your personal spiritual journey, with your search for meaning, with your everyday life? Because here's the core point of everything the Gnostics taught, and what Jesus, according to these texts, specifically came to reveal. The knowledge that liberates isn't knowledge about external things, it's knowledge of yourself. Gnosis isn't information, it's transformation. And that transformation doesn't happen because you read a 4th century manuscript or watched a YouTube video. It happens when what you learn finds something within you that already knew, that always knew, but that was systematically silenced. And it's exactly this inner dimension, this connection between forbidden knowledge and living spirituality, that transforms everything we've discussed so far from interesting history into something that can truly change your life. There's a phrase that appears multiple times in Gnostic texts, in slightly different variations, but always with the same core message. Know yourself, and you will know the universe and the gods. You probably recognize that phrase. It's inscribed on the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. It was cited by Socrates as the foundation of all genuine philosophy. And it appears, in different forms, in the teachings of Jesus preserved in the Gospel of Thomas and other Nag Hammadi texts. This is no coincidence. It's the convergence of a profound spiritual tradition that existed before Christianity, that Jesus embodied and radicalized, and that was deliberately disconnected from official Christian teachings to create a religion of dependence instead of a spirituality of liberation. For the Gnostics, and for Jesus in these forbidden texts, the fundamental problem of human existence isn't sin in the conventional moral sense. It's not that you've done wrong things that need forgiveness from an external deity. The problem is forgetfulness. The Greek word the Gnostics used was leth, meaning oblivion or forgetfulness, the same root as the river Lethe in Greek mythology, the river of forgetfulness that souls drank from before reincarnating. Human beings, according to this view, aren't fundamentally sinful. They are fundamentally asleep. They've forgotten who they are, where they come from, and what their true nature is. And Jesus, in the Gnostic context, didn't come to save sinners through a blood sacrifice. He came to awaken the sleeping through knowledge, through gnosis, through the revelation of humanity's true nature. This distinction seems subtle, but it's absolutely fundamental. A religion built on the idea that you are a sinner and need salvation creates a psychological state of guilt, unworthiness, and dependence that you need to resolve through an external intermediary, be it a priest, a pastor, an institution. A spirituality built on the idea that you are divine and need awakening creates a psychological state of inner seeking, of self-knowledge, of progressive expansion of consciousness that is, by definition, incompatible with any form of external control. Buddhists will immediately recognize this framework. The idea that human suffering stems from forgetting one's Buddha nature, which is present in all beings, and that spiritual practice is a process of removing veils that obscure this already present nature that's virtually identical to what Christian Gnostics taught. And it's no coincidence. Ancient world trade routes carried Buddhism from India to Syria and Egypt, and scholars like Professor Richard Foltz have documented the impact of Buddhist ideas on the development of Mediterranean Gnosticism in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Islamic Sufis have a concept called fana, which means the annihilation of the ego in the presence of the divine, and another called baka, which means permanence in divine consciousness after that annihilation. Rumi, the 13th century Sufi poet, wrote, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop." That's gnosis. In Arabic, in verse 7 centuries after Nag Hammadi, but it's the same knowledge. The same affirmation that divinity isn't something external to be achieved, but something internal to be recognized. The Jewish Kabbalistic tradition speaks of the divine spark, the nitzatz, which is imprisoned in every material thing, and that spiritual work, tikkun olam, the repair of the world, consists of liberating these sparks and returning them to their divine source. The parallelism with the Gnostic concept of the spiritual spark trapped in the material world is so precise that many scholars debate whether there's direct influence or if the two systems independently arrived at the same conclusions about the nature of spiritual reality. What does all of this tell us? That there's an underground current in humanity's spiritual history, a current that was never completely suppressed despite all efforts, that consistently affirms the same thing in different languages, in different cultures, in different eras. You are more than you've been told you are. Reality is more than you've been shown it is. And the path to liberation necessarily passes through the interior, through self-knowledge, through gnosis. Jesus, in the texts that were buried in the desert for 2 millennia, appears as one of the most radical bearers of this message, not as a being separate from humanity who redeems it from the outside in, but as someone who came to show, by his own example, what a human being can become when they awaken to their true nature. And the resistance he encountered, the persecution, the crucifixion, the subsequent distortion and suppression of his most radical teachings, all of it makes sense within a pattern that repeats every time this message of inner liberation threatens the power of those who benefit from collective slumber. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now's the time. Alright, if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell right now, because the content coming up on this channel is going to keep digging deep into what's truly beneath the surface of the reality we've been handed. And here's the question I need you to drop in the comments right now. Deep down, did you already sense there was something more to spirituality and who you really are than what official religions taught you? Just comment yes or no below. That's it. I want to see how many people this message is resonating with, because what's coming up in the next segment of this video is going to connect all of this to your practical life, your everyday experience, and what you can actually do with this knowledge, starting now. I want you to pause for a moment, not just mentally, not figuratively. I want you to literally hit pause right now, take a deep breath, and consider everything we've covered together so far, because there's a point in any journey of knowledge where information stops being just interesting and starts feeling personal. And that point is right now. Think about your own spiritual journey. It doesn't matter if you grew up in a religious household or one with no spiritual practice at all. It doesn't matter if you identify as Christian, agnostic, atheist, Buddhist, or if you simply don't know. There's an almost universal experience among people who find their way to a video like this. That gut feeling that there's a gap between what you were taught about reality and what you intuitively sense reality is. A discrepancy between the official story of the world and something you pick up on the edges, in the quiet moments, when life confronts you with questions that no ready-made belief system can fully answer. Have you ever felt that? That sensation in the middle of a tough night, or during a moment of profound loss, or paradoxically, in a moment of such intense joy it almost hurts, that you are more than just the role you play in the world. That there's something inside you that observes everything, something that isn't fully defined by your name, your job, your stories, your successes, or your failures. That there's a dimension of your existence that escapes every definition you've ever been given about who you are. The Gnostics called this observer pneuma, the spirit. They distinguished it from psyche, the constructed personality, and soma, the physical body. For them, spiritual work was essentially the process of progressively identifying with the pneuma instead of the psyche. Not destroying the personality, but recognizing that the personality is a tool, not the essence. It's what Buddhists call anatta, the absence of a fixed and permanent self. It's what Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart called the ground of the soul, the core of being that exists beyond all form and definition. It's what the Sufis called root, the divine spirit that animates human beings but isn't exhausted by them. All these systems arrived at the same perception through different paths, and all of them, in their respective contexts, faced the same institutional resistance. Meister Eckhart was posthumously tried for heresy. Ibn Arabi, the great Sufi theosopher, was persecuted, and his books were burned in multiple cities. Giordano Bruno, who asserted the infinitude of the universe and the presence of the divine in all things, was burned alive in Rome in 1600. The list goes on, and the pattern is consistent. Every time someone states with sufficient clarity and power that the divine is within human beings and not exclusively outside them, the power structures that depend on monopolizing access to the sacred respond with force. So what does this mean for you personally? It means that the feeling of spiritual confinement many people carry, the sense that life should mean more, that there's a deeper purpose yet to be found, that the answers you've been given don't fully satisfy the soul's questions, that feeling isn't a weakness. It's not a lack of faith. It's not a problem you need to solve by being more obedient, believing more firmly, or finding the right religious denomination. That feeling is the pneuma stirring within you. It's the divine spark recognizing its confinement and seeking a way out. Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas says in Logian 70, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." This is one of the most psychologically precise statements about human nature ever written. What's repressed, denied, hidden within the psyche doesn't just vanish. It becomes a symptom. It becomes a repetitive pattern. It becomes the seemingly endless cycle of suffering. And liberation doesn't come from outside, from an external grace that descends upon you as an unearned gift. It comes from within, from the courageous process of looking at what's there, acknowledging it, integrating it, and allowing the light of self-knowledge to dissolve what ignorance has built. Carl Jung, who was deeply versed in Gnostic literature and wrote extensively about it, called this process individuation. The encounter with the shadow, with the denied parts of oneself, followed by the progressive integration of internal opposites until the emergence of a deeper, more stable center of identity. Jung saw Gnosticism as one of the first systematic attempts in Western history to map the unconscious and its process of transformation, and he viewed the suppression of Gnosticism as an enormous psychological cost to Western civilization, which was deprived of a language to constructively work with the depths of the psyche. The question that remains, and that I want you to carry with you, is this: what within you is still waiting to be brought forth? What truth about who you are, about what you want, about how you want to live, is buried under layers of conditioning, of fear, of other people's expectations, of the version of yourself that was built to survive in a system not designed for your flourishing? Because that question, that specific question, is the heart of what Jesus was teaching in those texts buried in the desert for 2 millennia, and it's as alive today as it was in the first century. So how do you step out of this spiritual matrix? How do you apply the knowledge we've explored so far to your concrete life, your daily routine, your relationships, your work, your mental and emotional health? Because knowledge that doesn't change anything in practice is just intellectual entertainment, and what we're discussing here deserves more than that. The first step, and it's one the Gnostic texts describe with remarkable precision, is recognition. Recognizing that you're operating within a system. That your beliefs about who you are, what's possible for you, what God is or isn't, what you deserve or don't deserve, these were largely installed by others. By family, by culture, by religion, by school, by media. This isn't a judgment on those influences, it's simply a factual observation. And the very act of observing that conditioning already begins to create a distance between you and the conditioning itself. The second step is interrogation. Not an anxious, destructive questioning, but a genuine, curious interrogation. What beliefs do you carry that you never consciously chose? What versions of the sacred, of the human, of the possible were implanted in you before you had the capacity to critically evaluate them? The Gospel of Thomas opens by saying that whoever seeks should not stop seeking until they find. And when they find, they will be disturbed. Disturbance is part of the process. It's not a sign you're going the wrong way. It's a sign you've gotten close to a truth that contradicts the installed conditioning. The third step is contemplative silence. All the traditions that have preserved elements of the inner knowledge we're discussing have some form of contemplative practice at their heart. Buddhist meditation, Christian contemplation, Sufi dakurg, Kabbalistic hitbonanut. Not because these practices are empty ritualism, but because the constant noise of the conditioned mind prevents the recognition of the silent observer that lies beyond it. 10 minutes of genuine silence a day, not the absence of sound, but a rest from the compulsive inner narrative, already begins to create the space where the penemet kautonakamiles partners to Christul West Pomport, for tonri sumas of growls instig, inshoot can trignai the growls, nurtures to twit, tur ache, kendabukov, ache for the one of meter, a calm not unerdisnim to bor champtoral, extreve is warn chistadiot naibit. The fourth step is revising narratives of guilt and unworthiness. One of the most damaging legacies of institutional Christianity, the one that suppressed Gnostic teachings, was the theology of total human depravity. The idea that human beings are fundamentally sinful, fundamentally unworthy, fundamentally separated from the divine by a constitutive flaw that can only be remedied from outside. This narrative, deeply installed in Western psychology, produces precisely the state of dependence, of low spiritual self-esteem, of submission to any authority that presents itself as an intermediary to the sacred, which was necessary for the functioning of the control system we discussed. Revising it doesn't mean denying moral responsibility. It means replacing guilt as the central mechanism of relating to the sacred with love, with a genuine desire for growth that is born not from the fear of punishment, but from the perception of one's own inherent dignity and potential. The fifth step is the community of seekers. Jesus didn't teach individually by chance. He formed a group. The Gnostics gathered in study and practice circles. Sufi orders have their Nag Hammadi, fi, ispoliground, the Tsark was when there's 3. Yonagasi slow, in the Garmotia. The Pertobor Boydel Lukwermanubiya, Barani Trines, Benosh Sidiv, Hitudald Bedas. Buddhist meditation groups have their Sangha. There's something in the awakening process that is fundamentally relational, that needs others as a mirror, as a witness, as companionship on the path. Find people who are also asking the questions you're asking. Not people who have ready-made answers to sell you. People who are on a genuine quest, with openness, with humility, with the courage to not know and keep seeking anyway. And the sixth step, perhaps the most important and the most overlooked, is expression. Knowledge that isn't expressed withers. The spark that doesn't manifest goes out. What's within you that needs to be brought forth, in the terms of Logian 70 of the Gospel of Thomas, needs to find form. It could be writing, art, music, deep conversation, action in the world. The creative and expressive dimension of spirituality has been systematically devalued by religions of conformity, which prefer the silent, obedient believer to the creative, questioning seeker. But it's in expressing what's deepest that integration happens, that knowledge becomes life instead of remaining mere theory. Valentinus, the great Gnostic of the 2nd century, said that ignorance produced anguish and terror and pain like a dense fog, so that no one could see. The knowledge that dissolves that fog isn't information about the past. It's the recognition in this moment that you're not just the product of your conditioning, that there's something in you that observes, that chooses, that awakens, that is more ancient and vaster than any story you've ever been told about who you are. This is the message that was buried in the Egyptian desert, that survived the fires of the Inquisitors. It appears in 1,000 different forms in all genuine spiritual traditions around the world. And that has reached you today, right here, right now. If you've stayed with me this long, you're not the same person who hit play at the start of this video, not because I magically transformed you, but because you chose to stay. You chose to listen. You chose to make space for uncomfortable questions, for truths that contradict what you were taught, for a version of spirituality that puts the power back in your hands. That, in itself, is an act of awakening. And most people who started this video didn't make it this far. You did. That says something about you. If this video opened a window in your mind, if something we discussed resonated with something you already felt but didn't have words for, then hit that like button right now. That simple gesture helps this content reach more people who are looking for exactly this, and it makes a real difference for the channel to keep existing and bringing you this kind of deep dive investigation. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and ring that bell, because what's coming up next on this channel is going to go even deeper into everything we touched on today. And in the comments, I want a sign from those of you who stuck around till the very end. Type the phrase Awakened Spark. That's it. I want to see the warriors who had the courage to stay to the finish, to face the tough questions, to not shy away when the content started challenging the comfortable. Awakened Spark in the comments, right now. And check out the video popping up on your screen right now. It's the direct continuation of what we just explored here, diving even deeper into something we mentioned today that deserves a full deep dive all on its own. You won't want to miss it. See you there.